My name is Shailesh Shukla, and I also teach in Indigenous Studies, the same department that Priscilla teaches at the University of Saskatchewan. She is a professor there. She comes from the Cumberland Swampy Cree Nations from Saskatchewan, so she has different dialect of Cree. I'm just trying to understand different Cree languages. My introduction to Priscilla was, she was running a rival course at the Urban and Inner City Studies a few years back. I was doing course in this campus, this land, this main campus. So we kind of bumped into each other. She said, why don't you come and talk about your course? So we were trying to get students, in our classes. We are both competing, I think, in a way. So I ended up giving a guest lecture in her class, and she ended up giving a guest lecture in my class. That's why we got introduced to common interest. But Priscilla, I must say that she's a fearless foe. Foe in my language is an aunt. So in my language, foe is a fearless. Somebody that I really learned quite a lot as a mentor, as a friend, as a guide, as a young scholar who is just trying to understand Indigenous food systems, Indigenous knowledge systems. Priscilla has authored 3 books so far. In 2011, she wrote a book on Pima Tiswin called Global Indigenous Knowledge Systems. She also wrote another book, which is The Strength of the Women, Kame Imok 2011, which talks about the strength of Indigenous women and their contributions and stories in reconciliations, resurgence, truth. And she also was a co-editor of another book called Expressions in Indigenous Canadian Native Studies, which is considered as a textbook in the universities. So this is what Priscilla, in terms of academic hats, she also wears a gardener hat. And why I call that is because she is a loving kokum, grandma of two granddaughters, Naya Lily and Lola Rose. And she's also a gardener because she is the founding member of City Park Community Garden at the city of Saskatoon. So that's another hat. And she's also board member of Seed Save Canada, Global Cultural Conservancy Board. And most recently, she has been appointed as a David Suzuki Fellow, through which she is looking at climate change, the response, Indigenous perspective, knowledges and a response to climate change, which is kind of becoming a very, very big issue and very important issue. So without further ado, let me invite a caring kukum, an inspiring Indigenous scholar, a marvelous mentor, and an ardent food activist, a global scholar, my dear friend, my kokum, and my fearless foe, Dr. Priscilla Settee. Thank you. Nigoch.
I'd like to echo the acknowledgements of land and water that opened up the meeting, and I'd like to thank the lecture series for inviting me, and it's a big honor to be among relatives and friends and former students. And I just want to start the talk today with the announcement that over 2,250 professors and scholars, as of yesterday, from across Canada, around the world, signed the Statement of Solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people of British Columbia. And I want to read just the first couple of sentences in their statement because it's really timely and because I have the mic. We are writing to express deep gratitude to the Wet'suwet'en people who have been acting with formidable and strength to defend their people and territories from pipeline development, and have been facing violent incursion from the RCMP for doing so. They have been holding this line for years, caring for the lands and waters for countless generations. For many others, the Wet'suwet'en camp represents resurgence, reconnection, creativity, and relationship to the land. The long struggle of the Wet'suwet'en is a legitimate, legally sanctioned for rights, autonomy, and sovereignty on their unceded territory, and these efforts benefit all Canadians. We send our deepest thanks. So I'm going to just describe how I will approach this next 30 minutes or so, starting with the Indigenous worldview, which encompasses really more than just where we're in this room, in this province, in this country, and the impact that it has for humanity and society at this moment. It's huge. And I want to end my lecture with how communities are pushing back and creating societies of hope. And I think that that's really important at this time, because there is a lot of things out there that are very disturbing, that has been humanly created and therefore needs to be humanly uncreated, so to speak. So Shailesh made reference to some of these, but I'm just going to quote my great friend and mentor and colleague, Lara Fitzner, Dr. Lara Fitzner, who back when I was a graduate student at U of M, introduced me to this notion of a frame of reference. And I've used it a lot because I think it's really important that, you know, we are who we are today because of our relationships and because of all that we've been through. So I'm happy to be an adjunct professor here at the NRI at the University of Manitoba, because I get to read all the latest stuff that students, graduate students, are doing, particularly around food sovereignty, Indigenous food sovereignty. So that's really important. And I also thank Dr. Shirley Thompson and Dr. Shailesh Shukla for always pulling me in and helping and meeting with students and having one of the final says on their PhD documentation. This year I was so happy to be appointed by the David Suzuki Foundation as a fellow, where I get the great job of interviewing trappers and really talking about the impact of climate change on their livelihoods, their way of life, and the world, really. And finally, I'm a fabric artist, and I work on traditional Cree art forms with a contemporary focus as well, around the topic of preserving biodiversity and knowledge. My research has taken me to different regions of the world, including South Africa, South America, the Philippines, South Pacific, Vanuatu, Hawaii, Peru, Bolivia, India, Asia, with scholarly and, more importantly, or as importantly, community-based Indigenous groups. And, you know, initially it wasn't my desire to do a PhD. In fact, I got it rather late in life, but I just saw this immense body of knowledge that really reflected who our people were as Indigenous and the amazing struggles that these people all over the world were engaged in around the natural environment and keeping Indigenous knowledges alive. And certainly Shailesh has been a really important piece of that work with me. I'm going to talk just a little bit about our latest hot off the press co-editing publication called Indigenous Food Systems, Concepts, Cases, and Conversations. It's a really hopeful book of community-based organizing around food procurement, really important stories. So here's some of the lovely book covers, done all by my relatives. There's no nepotism there. And this is our last book that it arrived in the mail last week, called Indigenous Food Systems, with Dr. Shailesh Shukla. So in 2018, my Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations asked me to do a policy paper on food sovereignty. And I was thrilled to do that because, as Shailesh said, you know, I'm active in the community, but I also come from a very rich traditional food production community that has been heavily impacted by mega dam, the big dam upstream. And so I was happy to do that because I got to interview 3 large communities, extended communities, about what the state of their foods were, what was the state of their foods. And without exception, they were telling us that, Western development is taking its toll on our foods and on our lands, and we've really got to pay attention. And one in particular, it was a trapping circle from in La Ronge, Saskatchewan, and I interviewed about 40 trappers. And I was so overwhelmed by what they were telling me. I was saddened. I mean, it was clear that nobody was paying attention to this body of knowledge that trappers possess that is in big danger of disappearing because of Western development. And so as a result of that study called Maskigi Mitsoen, medicine food, I said, I got to go deeper with the trappers and really honor their word and, do something about it. So I applied for a Suzuki fellowship, and lo and behold, it came about. So started that in January, and I'm in the middle of it now. And but the powerful message that came out of this Muskegee study was that while communities, Indigenous knowledge is very much alive and has the power and capability to influence and reverse the trend of a suffering world, indeed it is this dearth of knowledge and value systems that the suffering of a world taxed and stressed almost beyond no future needs at this moment. To ensure the continuity of that knowledge and to grow hope, First Nations need to have advocacy by leaders to take bold action to ensure their leaders. So what that means is that each of us has a piece of that responsibility. And I think what the news has shown us, not just this week, but in decades gone by, that really, it really strikes at the heart of what citizenship is and what our duties as citizen to planet Earth is all about. So it's a big challenge to all of us, not just the people who get to call themselves professors, but to students and professors alike, and people who are engaged in all walks of life. So the 2018 Living Planet report states that global wildlife populations have fallen by 60% in the last 4 decades. In Canada, mammal populations have dropped by 43%, amphibian and reptile population dropped by 34%, fish populations have dropped by 20%, and some types of birds have lost between 43 and 69% of their populations. And, this is just chilling. About 6 weeks ago, I was in Cuba, and usually when you go to tropical countries, you just hear all sorts of birds. I heard not one bird. It was really chilling. And even in my backyard, the same exists. So we're losing 200 to 300 species per day. We have lost over 1 million species to date. In Saskatchewan, and that's part of my frame of reference, we have the Saskatchewan Primrose Bombing Range. It's a huge tract of land that was unilaterally taken away from trappers and hunters to set up a bombing range. And there's decommissioned or bombs that are still live that haven't been dealt with. But trappers still go into this area to provide food for their families and communities. And we have cases of, hunters being charged with hunting out of season. We have cases of biopiracy. And this week, one of my friends showed me what the province of Saskatchewan is doing to further attack trappers. They're removing, they're burning, and they're trashing trappers' cabins. Alberta's tar sands next door to us has been called the most destructive project in the world on traditional lands. There's 23 known cases of cancers in that region that is directly linked to the drippings from the tailings ponds into the river that the people still rely on, because who can pay that huge amount of money for bologna, and who wants to eat that anyway? And here in the province, over 100 dams have created absolute discord in northern communities. There are still cases of people living in hotels here in the city. And Dr. Merle Ballard, my colleague, has documented that in her film, Flooding Hope, the Lake St. Martin First Nation story. And all over the world and locally, we have like 11 or so land grabbers that make it their business to go and scoop up the last vestiges of what they call, nobody owns this land. But really, there's people on that land. And this is part of the bigger political parcel that we are fighting against, that must be deeply understood as power and control of lands that are usually traditional lands. In January this year, we have clear cuts by the Carrier Company out of British Columbia to clear every last tree in our north. And here's pictures of Elder McAdam, who is now passed on last year, looking at his trap line. And an aerial picture of the clear cuts in the north of my province, and Sylvia McAdam on the bottom left hand with the scores of trees just by the side of the road. It's absolute barbarism. All of this, and these are pictures of course, the massive fires in Australia. And this is happening all over the world, in Brazil, in Africa. And I mean, it's probably not news to most people in this room, but the provinces have a duty to consult. It's a statutory, contractual, and common law obligation that must be fulfilled by the Crown prior to taking actions or making decisions that may have consequences for the rights of Indigenous people in Canada. And what are they doing? They're jailing people. They're jailing youth today as we speak. And I know that this week there was a huge resistance march through the streets of Winnipeg, which is really great. It's tyranny, and people of good hope and faith must stand up to these methods of development that are just creating all sorts of chaos. Here is a turbo that one of the northern fishers pulled out of the Dene lands in the north, and it's riddled with cancer. People, these are some of the ones they catch. People have to live or forced to live, but what alternative is there? So I do a lot of work, as I mentioned, on food sovereignty, and it's really reflected in the health and well-being of our communities. It's based on the food crises, that's based on development and food justice, which is ultimately the bigger picture of the environmental crises we are experiencing. So the industrial food system, which is heavily reliant on pesticides, herbicides, Western science, large-scale methods of production, is one of the largest contributors of greenhouse gases, resulting in climate change. So this loss of local autonomy and small farming communities, in the case of Saskatchewan and here, asks us about what we can do. What is our role as health and education people? What is the role of students, professors, knowledge creators? Who is doing what? And how do we build coalitions of solidarity to address these challenges? These are really, really awesome and heavy questions. I was really thrilled 2 years ago to be invited to the U of M to a water conference that the law students at U of Manitoba were hosting, and I was so amazed, impressed, and absolutely in love with the work that these young allies were doing. They're doing solid work on the state of our waters, because water is life. The UN in 2015 reported that the demand for water will increase by 55% over the next 15 years. By that time, global water resources will meet only 60% of the world's demand. And as of 2016, there were 163 drinking water advisories in 119 First Nations in Canada. And because of some pressure, that number was lowered to, I think, 149. It could have changed, but not significantly. And, you know, the other thing that the government of Canada and other provincial governments don't put their focus on is the fact that we need a strong national plan of action based on a new water ethic that puts water protection and water justice at the heart of all our policies and laws. That's what we need. And no matter how many times we meet with ministers, it doesn't seem that they get it. So more than 15,000 scientists from 184 countries have issued a warning. And we need to be talking about this in our classrooms, in our churches, in our synagogues, wherever we are, that humankind must take immediate action to reverse the effects of climate change, deforestation, and a species extinction before it's too late. The warning was issued by the Alliance of World Scientists and published in a journal called Bioscience. Comes on the 25th anniversary of a similar warning from the Union of Concerned Scientists that was titled World Scientists Warning to Humanity, the new letter. However, the new letter has 10 times as many scientists endorsing it now. So, you know, the scientists have spoken up, some of them, but here, unfortunately, are our politicians discussing global warming. Just throw a little humor in there, it's so heavy. So at our School of Environment and Sustainability, David Suzuki came and gave an address on climate change, and he has told us that humanity may last to 2100, but by 2050 may see half of the world's population disappear. So he's predicting that by 2100 there will be no life on Earth. And we look around the world and we see this and we think, well, wow, that's really chilling and that's really disturbing for a grandmother, that my little kids won't have to have the good life that I've had. So Suzuki has done development of fellowship program, and I encourage you to check it out on his website. And what he's done is hired, I think I'm the oldest one, but all the rest are young scholars that are doing this really important research, and it's so hopeful. And we did a huge meeting talking about how we're going to develop, you know, policies that does make a difference in society. Because, you know, here in these hollowed halls, that's what we're supposed to be doing. And it's not happening fast enough. So it's really a wake-up call and a way of saying, reminding of us of our duties and our privileges as educators and learners. We're all educators. So who are the culprits? Well, agribusiness, which is any business that earns revenue from agriculture, has had deaths associated with it. With the report, 46 activists killed in dispute over large-scale agriculture projects. So that lettuce that may be on your plate, we need to examine how ethically that was produced. And here in Canada, we have a big problem with how our foods are produced unless we grow them locally. And I've learned a great deal from food justice movements, largely people of color initiated. And, you know, there's workers that are brought in from all over the world to produce our foods. And when they're injured, you know, they don't have the same rights as Canadian citizens. And that shouldn't be happening in a country like Canada. So if somebody is terribly injured on the job, they're shipped back to their country of origin. So they're brought in as workers, but they don't have full rights to citizenship. And we need to pay attention to that. In how our food is being produced, and also to the fact that in some regions of the world, our food is being produced and people are being killed in the process. Agribusiness was followed by the oil and mining industry, which has historically been the most dangerous field for activists, with 40 killings. And a lot of this data is not even that recent. Poaching and logging were tied for third with 23 reported deaths each. According to the international environmental organization Global Witness, 2017 saw a total of 207 killings of environmental activists or defenders, many of these Indigenous people. And as a young woman, when I was traveling through Latin America in the late 70s, I saw these killings, like evidence of these firsthand, and it became an amazing politicization of how our world is treating Indigenous people and anybody who stands up for justice and land rights, really. So in Canada, we've got many, many, many outstanding land claims. And of course, the whole business of land grabs that usurps land or sells it to a millionaire before these land claims get settled. We have the disappearing species, and land-based people are the first to notice. These same people are met with structural unemployment and water contamination, and if and when people do migrate to the urban, we're often met with a lack of opportunity in the form of no social housing, high rates of unemployment. So all of this, of course, has history. So some of the pivotal historical events that in part pertain to food is that early government policies deliberately undermined Indigenous sovereignty. And James Daschuk, my colleague, in his very famous book, Clearing the Plains, outlines how this happened. Sarah Carter, another amazing historian. And these are people I teach about in my food sovereignty courses because they've taken the time to look at, in the fine detail of how Canada was settled as a nation and how it was so unequal. And even when in this province, when Dakota farmers were outpacing local settler farmers, the government, those farmers got hold of the government and made them pull in the reins on these Dakota farmers. And this is all written about, along with the early unethical food experiments that currently have health impact today, the high rates of diabetes, etc. These were all put in place when Canada was being settled as a country. In the meantime, we folks have been fighting back. We have resisted the intellectual property approach to rights as established in the Convention on Biological Diversity. Indigenous people were at the front line when this CBD was being negotiated, because at that time, nation states were, at that time it was Brazil, and they were carving out all the lucrative parts to biodiversity. But Indigenous people pushed back. And, I know that some of us in the room were at these meetings, and, it was formidable, the power of the state against Indigenous peoples. Similarly to no patents on life, it was Indigenous people from India who said patents are meant to put ownership on mousetraps and toasters, not on human life or plant life. And then locally, people have been very concerned by developing, food charters that really outline our concerns around food and nutrition. And all of this, of course, is within the frame of international trade policies. And one of the talks I gave last week was suggesting that First Nations were not part of this process. And as far as I know, we're not. I know that civil society in other forms has been there pushing, but I don't believe First Nations leadership have gotten involved. And these are the very powerful places where decisions are made around human rights at a very local level. Through demands of international financial institutes, such as the International Monetary Fund, I heard last week that Argentina said, we're not paying the IMF any more money until they smarten up and stop treating us like a doormat. The World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and their structural adjustment programs. So as far as we know, there are no protection of treaty territories, land, air, and water, biodiversity, food, and sacred sites, and this is a problem. So I'm going to get to the good part now. What is to be done? And if David Suzuki saw me drinking this bottled water, he'd say, "That's it." But I have a little bit of a cold. So one of the things that we can do is fossil fuel divestment, which aims to reduce carbon emissions by accelerating the adoption of renewable energy through the stigmatization of fossil fuel companies. And there are organizations busily doing this. This includes putting public pressure on companies that are currently involved in fossil fuel extraction to invest in renewable energy. We have the capacity to do that. And really, we should be congratulating Wet'suwet'en for standing up for us in a very practical way and getting criminalized for doing that. We need to see the link between food insecurity, environmental injustice, and justice in general. These are all linked. These are all inextricably linked. We need to give and teach alternatives. A couple that I've developed over the last half a decade or so is development into the 21st century development of social economies and, of course, Indigenous food sovereignty. We need, and this is coming from my colleague, super wicked policies and fight back strategies, because there's no central authority, even though the federal government believes they are the central authority. But when it comes to Indian issues, no way. Solutions must be implemented at all levels of government, among non-state actors and individuals, and civil society. If they are doing some very brilliant things. And certainly Manitoba is really in the lead on many fronts. Economic signals must be corrected and redirected to include economic decisions with strong goals, substantive and procedural environmental rights for humans and nature, and to ensure a voice and recognition of discounted and ignored voices. We shouldn't have to take to the streets to have our voices recognized, but that is exactly what we are being forced to do. So we need some reasons for hope, and believe me, there are many of them. And I have to say, primarily because of where I come from and my people, we weren't supposed to be standing here giving lectures at university podiums. We weren't. At one time, we were denied status in any of the sciences, the places that we were sent to. Some of the people who came before me was religion and education. And so we weren't supposed to be in the sciences. But we have these values. We have these values that are really important at this time of our development. And I'm just going to mention some of them because they're very powerful and profound. And one of them is called Wahotwin, which means that we are all related. And another one is Miowititowin, which means that we do our actions for the greater good of humanity, not for the corporate pot. And that we are guided always by Sagodawin, which means love for humanity. And those must be our guiding principles. And certainly this has led to a resurgence in awareness among our youth. It's our youth that are in jail today because they are demanding that those principles be brought back by all forms of leadership. And where's our Prime Minister? Making nice in Africa. So I'm very fortunate to be in the discipline of Indigenous studies because I believe that we are making deep strides in decolonization, curriculum design methodologies, and pedagogies based on worldviews of what I mentioned prior. We must put women and children at the center of development. But when we look at the pyramid of so-called development, it is primarily white male and a very small, it's been referred to as the 1%. We must consider intersectionality and relationality. We are all related. We are maybe separated by some intersections, but we have a lot to accomplish together. And I'm just going to close with mentioning some of my heroes and some of the people that are doing the tremendous work in the front seats. My sweet colleague, Ian Morrow. Aki Enterprises, which focus on renewable energy, on Meacham Project, a food producing amazing, I'm so in love with this group. Healthy food boxes. Like, these are miracle workers led by former Chief Darcy Wood and my good friend Shaun Loney. And I'm going to quote them. For too long, we have used the same old business models to solve Indigenous problems, issues that we've been getting nowhere. Aki takes business tools and works to indigenize them, developing new approaches to old issues. Here at the University of Winnipeg, you have something called Diversity Food, which uses the model of social enterprise to use local food production to feed yourselves. They purchase 65% of their food needs from the small farm movement. That's a celebration. Transformative action that governments can do to support the local food industry to develop the local economy. We all need food. And I always say in talks I give that food has the capacity to unite the entire world, to create a better world. And here are the boys and some girls. Darcy Wood and Shaun Loney, examples of engaged citizenry. Allies, I love this one, the Northern Manitoba Food Culture and Community Collaborative. They've managed to, I don't know if anybody from the group is here. Oh, thank you. She's one of my heroes. It's an innovative collaborative of Northern community people, Northern advisors, funders, and organizations working together to foster healthier and stronger communities in Northern Manitoba through improved access to healthy foods and the development of resilient local economies. So I want to thank them, and that's their little logo. And if you go on their website, you can read up on their principles and their amazing work. And I want to also acknowledge Tabitha Robin Martins. I don't know if she's here, but she's got a chapter in our new book. Finally, the David Suzuki Fellowships. They've been around, I think, since 2018, and they're developing solutions to the climate crises. And this year, his foundation is the first Indigenous Knowledge and Climate Change Fellow. So I want to just end my talk on highlighting some of the youth leadership in Canada, notably Melina Labucan-Massimo, who's been named a Canadian eco hero. She's a steadfast advocate for Indigenous rights and environmental justice with a practice that considers the interrelation between both concerns. A Lubicon Cree from Little Buffalo, Labucan has long sought to expose the impacts of tar sands in her home region, while her commitment to Indigenous issues has extended to work throughout the globe. She established Sacred Earth Solar, formerly Lubicon Solar, which helps Indigenous communities attain energy sovereignty through the use of solar power. Takaya Blaney, who's from the West Coast, grew up along the shores of the Salish Sea in BC. She's a winner of the Best Video 2017 American Indian Film Festival. Earth Revolution is a movement of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people fighting together for the same future. Furthermore, a global action fabricated of empowered and inspired children and youth. She says, I will dedicate myself to saving what is near to my heart and the heart of my culture by transforming words into actions and actions to results. I fight for the recognition of rights for both Indigenous people and the environment. I call for a worldwide full implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I have used her message since she was a little girl of 12. But she has just risen to incredible courage, and I believe she's sitting in a jail cell this week. she's on the front lines of Wet'suwet'en. So there is Melina, pictures of Melina. So I just want to end by saying talking about the importance of international linkages and networking, teaching and research to promote understanding. Climate change is a result of energy policies that depend on fossil fuel production. Risk assessment policies that don't protect Indigenous lands and resources and environmental health, and the impacts of how economic globalization, regional, bilateral, and global trading mechanisms such as the FTA and Western forms of development that are non-sustainable. These are at the root of the problem. We need Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination that focuses on development for the people, that values people, that localizes development systems, that puts control locally, that builds knowledge and skills, not teaches children how to despise themselves and to work with nature. This I've quoted for many years is one of my heroes, Chico Mendes, who was a rubber tapper in the Brazilian rainforest, and he died many years ago. He was murdered, and he said, "At first I thought I was fighting to save rubber trees. Then I thought I was fighting to save the Amazon rainforest. Now I realize I'm fighting for humanity." And I think, it's a very inspirational quote that hit me when I was very young and still sticks with me. So thank you to Wet'suwet'en Strong. The hereditary chiefs had said no to all pipelines, and I stand with Wet'suwet'en. And this week I was just up visiting people at Makwasagayan, which is Loon Lake, and they are asking for help from the public to say no to the pipeline, and they haven't been consulted with. And so I have the good fortune to work with them around sustainable futures, but also to get the word out that they have not given their consent to the pipeline. So thank you, and we have some time for questions, I think. Better?
I've got lots of questions, but not enough time. And I have to run out at 1:30.
Plug your meter.
So if someone,
Yeah.
no, I have to go on TV.
Go ahead.
I'd rather be here, but in any case, okay. So I'm a bit of a word nerd. I believe that how we talk about things matters, how we define them, and for something we put in our mouths on a constant basis, we rarely think about food, right? It's such a basic word, food. And to me, there's two broad ways to look at food. As a basic commodity, which seems to be the prevailing view in this society, or as the basis of community. And I wonder if you could speak some more to that distinction.
So commodity versus community?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And food's
In fact,
role in both.
In fact, food has become a solely for profit endeavor as we look at the corporate side of food production. And what was the other?
Commodity versus community.
Community, yeah. So for example, in my province in Saskatchewan, we used to produce 80% of our food with the help of farmers, but of course our communities were a different thing. And now we import 80% of that food, and we produce maybe 20. So we need a food revolution, and I'm so glad that there are so many people that are working on food, because it has the capacity to unite us all, and it's delicious. It's like a social thing. And we start all our important meetings with food, like, where's my steak sandwich? I'm teasing.
Where is my
of course.
steak
Yeah,
sandwich?
what happened to the food? This is not a meeting
Next
without.
time, can we?
But so food is really a connector, and
Well, can I ask you something that's going to sound kind of dumb? Like, how do you define food in a way that captures what we're talking about here.
I think culture, like, you know, in Shalish, when we pull this book together, it's really the stories of food builders, like people rebuilding their community, reclaiming power, and you know, it's so much a part of our culture. And now I've heard from one of our scientists that what's that, chronic wasting disease is among our moose. And that's really concerning. And that, you know, it hasn't been properly researched yet. So that's where we need help, you know, establishing the safety of our food, because it's very much at the heart of culture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, near the start of your talk, you note that Indigenous peoples are the largest contributors to the world's food origins. And I don't know how many people are honestly aware of that. And I'm hoping you can expand on it. Can you, in fact, how many foods are we talking about here? Can you give us a sense?
I think there's probably better experts in the room than me. But, you know, if you look at all our vegetables, just about every food has been finessed by Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, they didn't just pop them out of the ground and go, look what I found. Like they actually, I hesitate to use this word, but engineered them into existence, right?
You could
Corn,
use that
potato,
word. Yeah.
tomato.
And women, of course, have been at the center of that, because women are the ones that save the best seeds and nurture and plant and usually prepare and do all of that. And so what's really interesting about the food movement globally, when it became a big issue, like when wasn't it an issue, but you know, where it became more of a political issue was when women were being battered and unable to do the food stuff. And so violence against women was at the principle of food sovereignty, that women were saying, we demand an end to of violence because we are unable to do our jobs. And so it was a really dramatic moment when, for example, La Via Campesina organized to say, you know, we are going to establish food sovereignty as a principle of humanity, because it has to be based on violence-free societies. So that's a powerful concept. Yeah, because it's still, you know, domestic violence is still a big issue today in Canada and throughout the world.
You know, anytime I hear about this veritable cornucopia that Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledge has brought into being, I can't help but wonder where the royalties for all this are. I mean, I know you don't want to put this into the frame of intellectual property, but arguably it's stolen intellectual property. Where are the reparations? Where are the royalties for this? Given that Indigenous foods have continued to feed the world. If they invented them, quote unquote, today, that'd be huge.
The thing about foods have always been freely gifted.
Yes.
You know, always shared publicly. But it was when the Western concept of proprietary rights said, ooh, I think I can make some money if I alter this gene and claim it as my personal property. So this is what people were fighting about, not so much to get profit, but to get acknowledgement and to be ensured that there would be no danger to their actual intellectual property of having developed these wonderful foods. So it's trying to like compare like two value systems, one of proprietary rights, capitalism, I'll say it, and then one of freely gifted knowledge.
I thought you were going to say apples to oranges.
Yeah, I was good at it. Well, it is apples to oranges.
Now,
Sorry.
you know, I'd like you to talk just a little bit more about your work as one of 7, I think, David Suzuki Fellows this year. On their website, it said you will, quote, work with northern Indigenous trappers to learn about climate change impacts on their livelihoods and the environment, unquote. Now, just to play devil's advocate, the trap lines of Indigenous individuals up north seem a long way from the corporate boardrooms of cities like Toronto, New York, and London. Why did you decide to focus on the former when the latter, arguably, seem to be where all the problems originate?
Well, because those guys, the corporate boardrooms, aren't going to give one iota. Well, they don't usually. So rather than focusing on them, I think it's incumbent for me to broadcast where I come from, the people I work with that I love, that stand for so much more than the dollar. And so when I saw trappers crying, and one of my last set of interviews, one of the trappers said, Priscilla, when I look at the trees, I just cry because like all the black spruce in my community are virtually dead. And why? Because of the fluctuating water tables, like the dam gets let out and it floods the trees and then it dries up, that's how dams work. And so when he said, I just cry, like I almost cried right there. And, this is what motivates, or this is what trappers represent. That it's not just an economic thing, it's a way of life, and it's values that need to be broadcast, because this is what's lacking in modern development, is development without a soul, without any of those Indigenous values that I mentioned in my talk.
Well, it just popped in my head that one man's timber is another one's terrorism. I mean, you've basically laid to waste
Huge tracts of land.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact that we've lost so many species this year, this decade, this century, is really chilling.
You note how universities can be helpful through R&D to combat climate change, but to what extent are universities also part of the problem? For example, I did a quick Google search and on Canadian universities and divestment, and up came a 2018 article from Vice entitled "Canadian Universities Are Way Behind on Fossil Fuel Divestment," in which the author also notes universities receive research funding and donations from fossil fuel companies. For example, the University of Calgary's Enbridge Research Chair in Psychosocial Oncology. Assuming you agree, too, that Canadian universities invest way too much in the fossil fuel industry and take too much from those industries in turn, why do you think they've been slower to divest?
Because I think they lack the imagination. I really think that, more people are approaching me, well, not just me, but saying, when scientists discovered the chronic wasting disease in the moose, I got the email and said, listen, we need to do something about this, and I agreed. But I don't know, everyone has been schooled in such a neutral form of schooling that we don't develop critical thinkers. And a lot of university administrators and professors have been schooled in, very non-critical ways of thinking. And we as educators, we come from the trenches. We are critical thinkers of everything because it impacts us. And so I don't know, I had one professor say to me a couple years back, well, what is cross-cultural training? Is that like when you go running in the country? I go, what? So there's, we have such a capacity to do great things, and we are doing great things, but more of us need to recognize that we are on the edge of a precipice in terms of food, climate, energy. We can do better, and we need to do better. This place should be full of administrators getting a little lecture,
The stats you cite regarding the depopulation of mammals, amphibians, reptiles, fish, and birds, just in Canada alone, you call them chilling. To me, they're staggering. But, part of me is like, okay, well, at least this information is now out there, right? Knowledge is power, as they say. No one can say, oh, we didn't know, But here's my question. Given that more and more Canadians do know this, why is that knowledge not translating into more and more action?
Well, that's a really good question. Why is it not being made into policy and practice? Because I believe the energy and the pharmaceuticals and the agricultural corporate sector have got a real stronghold on knowledge production because it impacts their profits. And so it's no secret that more and more universities are relying on corporate funding to create their chairs and to give more money when governments cut back. That's the role of globalization. That is the role of these international treaty agreements that put all of these conditions in place so that there's less public accountability and transparency. So that's why we need to look at the bigger picture, because it's a decline back of civil society's rights. And so it's incumbent on all of us to be training our students, learning everything we can to know about power and control. And who's the best people to do it is Indigenous people, because it's been going on for so long, like colonialism, imperialism. You know, it's the history of the world, really.
But there are those, I mean, I think one dimension is the enormity of it, right? The scale of this all. I mean, it can be paralyzing, I think, to a certain extent. But at the same time, it's also, you know, by design, at many steps removed from us. I don't think, I don't want to open this water bottle. Take one for the team here. I mean, I don't think I made that distinction between a trap line and Toronto. I mean, I don't think many corporate execs have been to a trap line. So they're at many steps removed from the consequences of the actions made, of those decisions made in those boardrooms. So I wonder too, though, your everyday Canadian, quote unquote, if it also feels way too abstract. I mean, how do we make it less abstract when, in some ways, the economy is designed to insulate us from how water got in this bottle? Like, I have no clue where the bottling plant is. I have no clue as to the source. I guess I could read it, but let's see, what does it say? It says it was bottled for Loblaws in Toronto. Anyway, but the bottle's 100% post-consumer recycled plastic.
Yeah. I guess the first thing that, maybe it's not relevant to this group, but turn off your television and like dig deeply and get to know your community. Like really ask those questions about what is to be done. And you know, get engaged, like get involved. Like we're in a big mess. I mean, anybody that looks out in Winnipeg and doesn't see a mess has got to be. But you know, the truth of it is that a lot of people are just going from day to day, barely alive. You know, people are hungry, a lot of poverty, and you know, housing is not in great shape. And you know, Canada used to stand for a fair amount of human rights at one point, but you know, successive governments have destroyed a large part of our healthcare system, our social housing program. We've never had a daycare program national, ever. So parents are living, many in poverty, just to try and get daycare for their kids. So we look at all the social support networks breakdown. Again, that is part of the process of globalization and privatization of services. Like if we lose Medicare, that's the thing that should scare us all, you know, and it's being clawed back. So we need to pay attention. Every time we've been told by whatever hospital that, you know, they're not hiring new workers after this phase is laid off. You know, those are things that should concern us. We have to see the intersectionality, interconnectedness of all of our worlds. Get to know our neighbor.
I have to go do some television, which we're not supposed to watch. For the Aboriginal People's Television Network, it's different, right? But I just want to say, Dr. Priscilla Settee, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.